Good evening, everyone. I'm Kevin Dindalk. I'm a professor of political science and director of the Henry Institute here at Calvin College. And on behalf of the Institute and our co-sponsors, the Calvin Institute for Christian Worship and the Center for Faith and Writing, it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here and to welcome James K. Smith to his home lectern. When I joined Calvin about 5 years ago, Jamie and I had not yet crossed paths, but we quickly recognized all kinds of convergences in interests and approaches, and it's been a highlight of my time here to become a colleague and a collaborator and a friend. Whether he's engaging public arguments in the Washington Post, or as it turns out, confronting sea turtles in distant oceans. That's a little bit of an, you might have to ask him about that later. I've come to know Jamie as fearless and bold and endlessly curious, and with the exception of the sea turtle episode, relentless in bringing the scandal of the cross into public conversation, whether in the Guild or in the broader culture. Jamie serves as professor of philosophy here at Calvin and also holds the Gary and Henrietta Biker Chair in Applied Reformed Theology. He is editor of Comment Magazine. I strongly recommend Comment Magazine to all of you, and author of too many books to rehearse here. I'll mention a few, or four to be precise. You Are What You Love, and the books comprising his cultural liturgies trilogy, Desiring the Kingdom, Imagining the Kingdom, and Awaiting the King. That latter book came out just last month, right? And it's already an award winner as of the last couple of days. And you can buy it along with the entire trilogy in the narthex or out here, 50% off. I think this is mixing of liturgies, yes. Perhaps, but I will recommend, stocking stuffer for Christmas. But you can buy that after the lecture tonight. And speaking of that lecture, here's the format. Jamie's going to speak for about 35 or 40 minutes. I am taking the co-sponsor's prerogative to sit down with Jamie for about 15 or 20 minutes up here for conversation, and then we'll open it up to the audience. We have a microphone set up here. Please use the microphone. This is being videotaped and audio taped, so that would be useful. Would you join me in welcoming Jamie Smith?
Thanks, buddy. Appreciate it. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. And big thank you to Kevin, both for being a friend and for making this possible and creating a little venue for this conversation. I really appreciate it. And the Henry Institute is one of the great energies on campus, so thank you for that. I'm also grateful to the co-sponsors. I should note, in a way, that this is co-sponsored by the Center for Christian Worship. In a sense, this book is the culmination of an idea that John Whitfleet put in my head probably a little over a decade ago, actually, which is, we were younger, I had a little more hair, John looked exactly the same, the way he has looked since 1987, and I'm really grateful. As I recall, it was John coming to my office and said, have you ever read Alexander Schmemann's For the Life of the World? And what could we do to reconnect worship and worldview? And here, a decade later. Very grateful, and grateful to Calvin for being the sort of place that lets me have a long leash and think this way. A funny thing happened as Christians marched out to transform the culture. They were transformed by it. We seem to have overestimated our convictions and powers of resistance, and we underestimated how cultural forces can deform us. Not because they change what we think, but because they transform what we love. Indeed, I'm reminded of a very jarring scene at the conclusion of Orwell's 1984. I'm not sure if you remember this from high school, perhaps, but in 1984, Winston Smith prides himself on being a resistor. He thinks he has everything he needs to resist Big Brother. So he can endure the charade of the 2-minute hate and all of the other civic rituals because he has something internal and secret. In fact, he and Julia always reassured themselves they can't get inside you. But when he's finally captured, He learns that what the party requires is not just obedience, not just allegiance, but love. It's not enough to obey, big brother, O'Brien tells him. You must love him. And in fact, they did find a way to get inside him, so that by the time you get to the end of that terrifying episode of his, remember there's this cage that's strapped to his face that involves rats, so just leave it at that. And at that point, he gazes up at the enormous face of Big Brother. 40 years it had taken him to learn what kind of smile was hidden beneath the dark mustache. Oh, cruel, needless misunderstanding. Oh, stubborn, self-willed exile from the loving breast. 2 gin-scented tears trickled down the sides of his nose. But it was all right. Everything was all right. The struggle had finished. He had won the victory over himself. He loved Big Brother. Friends, I fear that what has come to infect Christian political engagement is not just bad policy or misguided thinking, it's disordered love. It's what Augustine would diagnose as a love that characterizes the earthly city. So a big part of what interests me in this project in Awaiting the King is an account of the assimilation of Christians, and especially perhaps evangelicals, to the defaults of partisan politics in a polarized culture. And I want to suggest that there are 2 aspects of this. This is not all of it, but there are 2 sort of sides to analyzing and trying to account for this degree of our assimilation to the defaults of partisan politics. And the first side is this, that we missed the liturgical nature of politics and public life. We miss the liturgical nature of politics and public life. That the rhythms and rituals of public life aren't just something that we do, they do something to us. The public life into which we confidently bestride, equipped with our Christian worldview and marching orders for transformation, is not a neutral space. It is rife with rituals and liturgies that bypass our convictions and conscript our affections, so that we fall prey to political idolatries, not because we're convinced by bad ideas as much as we are converted by disordered liturgies. So I think part of the account of our assimilation to these defaults of partisan politics is our missing the liturgical nature of public and political life. But the other side is, I also think we miss the political nature of the church. That is, we miss the fact that Christian worship is the civics of the city of God. The practices and disciplines of historic Christian worship carry a gospeled social imaginary, a rehearsing of a biblical vision of shalom, flourishing, and justice that is caught by our immersion in the body of Christ. So while it may be counterintuitive, part of my argument is that the renewal of Christian political witness depends upon the renewal of the church. That is, the formation of citizens, politicians, civil servants who can contribute to the renewal and redemption of our public life depends on the renewal of the church and reforming our worship. Why? So that congregations can be biblically saturated, Christ-haunted imagination stations from which we are then sent to love our neighbors, steward creation, build institutions that guard the vulnerable. We need loves that are reformed and reordered by the civics of the city of God, precisely so we might know how to then prudentially forge a common life in the meantime of our waiting as we live alongside citizens of the earthly city. When we learn to love what Christ the King loves, but also how to await his coming, we will be better equipped for the messy work of faithful compromise that characterizes public life in what Augustine calls the saeculum, this time between times. One of the themes I want to draw out of Augustine is that for Augustine, the saeculum is not a space, it's not a place, it's a square. It's an era in which we find ourselves of contest between fall and kingdom come. In other words, and trust me, I know how crazy this sounds, I'm arguing that we don't need less Christian politics, but more. Now, before you get too worried about that, let me explain. Because, in fact, let me put it this way. I can imagine how my secular progressive neighbor is getting very anxious at this point, as if theonomy is just around the corner. Somebody's already queued up the Slate headline, I know. It's ready to come. But I want to suggest to even my secular progressive fellow citizen that in fact the opposite is true. That they too should hope for a more Christian politics from us. Because what passes for Christian politics today is usually a sub-Christian syncretism that prays to a vaguely moralistic God who plays favorites. A deity of our making who gets trotted out to license our nationalism and self-interest. So that what calls itself a Christian politics seems to show no sign of being disturbed by the cross or the ascension or the eschaton. If anything, the irony is that so much that calls itself Christian politics is governed by what Augustine would call the libido dominandi, the lust for power that he says is endemic to this earthly city, not the city of God. It's governed by this lust for power that's concerned only with winning, revenge, and resentment. In other words, too much of our so-called Christian politics seems to have been captivated by the liturgies of what Augustine calls the earthly city rather than the heavenly city. So in that sense, a more robust and specifically Christian political vision and witness would be a gift to a pluralist society, even if it is also a prophetic challenge. Christian political actors, agents, citizens will bring a life-giving imagination to our public life just to the extent that they are shaped and nourished by a robustly and distinctly Christian formation in the polis that is the church. It's just to the extent that we find our primary political identity in the city of God, in our heavenly citizenship, that we will cultivate then a posture that enables us to inhabit the contested terrain of temporal politics differently. Christians of all people should be the least inclined to treat temporal political allegiances as ultimate, which is precisely why we should resist demonizing our political adversaries. As the British theologian Oliver O'Donovan once provocatively put it, the most truly Christian state understands itself most thoroughly as secular. Let me say that one more time. The most truly Christian state, he suggests, understands itself most thoroughly as secular. Now, that does not mean it thinks of itself as godless, but rather it's an understanding of earthly city politics as less than ultimate, that government answers to someone beyond it, that politics is not ultimate. That's why I want to suggest that very specific, I already see the political scientist sort of maybe rolling his eyes a little bit. So I'm the philosopher theologian trying to make an injunction to what our political life is. And here's the audacity of it. I'm just going to lay it right on the table. The claim is that specific Christian doctrines make a difference for how we participate in public political life. That we can't just appeal to some generic natural insights about creation and moral order. And that those distinctly Christian doctrines now are rehearsed and enacted in the repertoire of Christian worship. Indeed, you might say that these are doctrines that we pray before we parse them. For example, the doctrines of the ascension of Christ and our eschatological longing have political fallout, distinctive political fallout. On the one hand, because Christ has ascended as king, all temporal authorities have become accountable to a higher one. All of our kingdom talk is vague and slippery unless it is hooked to the specificity of Christ the ascended king. But on the other hand, we still pray, "Thy kingdom come." And as long as we are praying, thy kingdom come, it means it's not here. So that there is a sense in which we are aware that it has not arrived in its fullness. Between those two realities, that Christ is the ascended King and that the fullness of the kingdom is something for which we are waiting, between those two realities, we live into our political vocations. On the one hand, you have a motivating North Star, and on the other hand, a tempering of our expectations. Our eschatological orientation changes our expectations, not our goals, I think. The work of public life, building institutions to organize and administer our shared life, collaborating to maintain everything from libraries to economies, all of this is actually part of our creaturely calling. It's a call to unpack and unfurl the possibilities of creation itself. That creaturely calling is renewed and directed by the cross and resurrection. And the biblical images of the kingdom of God in the prophets now are like revelatory sketches of what flourishing looks like that are revealed by the one who made us. So I'm suggesting that the messy work of forging a common life in the meantime of our waiting, again, what Augustine calls this seculum in which we find ourselves, which is, for Augustine, the seculum is this contested time in some ways between fall and kingdom come, certainly the contested time between cross and kingdom come, in which we share the territory of creation. The territory of creation is shared by citizens of the city of God and citizens of the earthly city who have to find ways of making peace, to collaborate, to live while we await. What I'm suggesting is that in the meantime of our waiting, that creaturely vocation of forging a shared life, even when we disagree about what the ultimate is, right? Even when we disagree about that the ultimate is better served, that work of forging a common shared life together, I'm suggesting, is better served if we, as participants in that mix, are informed, fueled, our imagination is shaped by a robust, specifically gospeled imagination. Here's a little bit of inside baseball since we're in Grand Rapids. I'm partly pushing back on a little bit of a tendency in our own Kuyperian tradition to think that when you're doing politics and public life, the specificity of cross and resurrection is supposed to be kind of gently set aside and you appeal to some other principles. And I'm suggesting that's not the best move for us and might be what gets us into trouble. We will be better citizens of our temporal, passing away nations if we are formed as citizens of the eternal, coming city of God. That our political imagination needs to be more biblical, not less. More cross-shaped, not less. More indexed to the hope of the kingdom and not less. Now, for us to be, aren't you glad we have a question and answer afterwards so that you can disagree with me? Now, for us to become that kind of people, the church needs to be a liturgical space that rehearses that biblical vision. That's why the shape of our liturgies and the practices of our congregations impinge on our political witness, and why the renewal of the Christian political labor depends in some ways on the renewal of the church. If our churches are simply hijacked and co-opted by secular liturgies of consumerism and nationalism, there is no way that they can be counterformative sites for the renewal of our political imaginations. They will just become more sites of reinforcing the political status quo. Too many congregations that gather every Sunday are enacting scripts that rehearse the narratives of market and national mythologies rather than the peculiarity of the city of God. Here's a first little criterion for you. If the choir at your church in Dallas is singing "Make America Great Again," red flag. There's a different story that's being rehearsed. Our worship, now, on the other hand, I do want to concede or recognize, and this is the last long chapter of the book, our own worship can be subject to a kind of liturgical capture. That is, our worship can be domesticated. And in that domestication, it actually undercuts the eruption of the gospel's political imagination. This is where I think the work of Willie Jennings and Brian Bantam and J. Cameron Carter has been so important in showing actually how heartbreaking and tragic and heinous it is when the liturgies of the church get co-opted by racialized ideologies. So Brian Bantam, in a really disturbing, really probing but tragic book called Redeeming Mulatto, which is very provocatively titled, in which he documents the way that baptismal liturgies in antebellum South had to be changed so that the liberating capacity of the gospel was muted and domesticated when slaves were baptized. That's what I'm saying. So I'm not saying worship per se does this work. It's what we are doing in our worship and what story is being rehearsed in our worship. What political story are we rehearsing in our worship? Does the worship of our congregations reflect the civics of the city of God? This is why I think the renewal of our public life depends on the renewal of our worship, and that the best hope for our political imagination is actually found in ancient practices and disciplines. Let me give you two examples. I love it that this book, Awaiting the King, has come out in this season, because here's one example. I want to suggest that the liturgical calendar of the church is a political discipline. The liturgical calendar is a political discipline. How would that work? I'll give you one example. We've just moved through this space. We're in Advent now. The really interesting thing is right before we begin Advent, which is the launch of our new year in which we learn how to journey again with Jesus, the culmination of the liturgical year is the Sunday before, which is Christ the King, the Feast of Christ the King. Isn't it ironic that there's so much of scripture and prayer and hymnody that is royal language, and it rolls over us and we miss the fact that this is politics. We're talking politics. So what's the significance of being a people, a congregation that lives into these stories of the liturgical calendar so that our season, in a way, our year culminates with Christ the King? Well, if Christ is King, then in a sense, all earthly rulers have already been deposed. There's something that has happened there with the ascension. They are stewards in the meantime. They can make no ultimate claims on us. When King Jesus knows the number of hairs on your head, you could never be reduced to some cog in a collectivist machine. It's what Oliver O'Donovan calls the desacralization of politics by the gospel, right? There's a certain kind of relativizing of the claims that political authorities would make on us. But notice, we then move as a congregation, as we're living into this story, we move from that culmination of the confession that Christ is King, which is why the creed is our pledge, and then we pivot to begin again the journey with Jesus in Advent, which is the season in which we learn how to wait. If you had Christ the King without waiting, that's when you slide into theonomy. Right? If you lack that discipline, we learn to wait, not in passive quietism, not in Pelagian activism, but in hopeful trust. The kingdom is something we await. It is not something we create. And I think that reality pushes back, on the one hand, on right-wing theonomies that forget this waiting, which are kind of practical postmillennialisms that assume the arrival of the kingdom is up to us and therefore something we should impose. But I also want to suggest it equally pushes back on the practical postmillennialisms that can characterize the left, that reduces justice to a social amelioration project that depends on us. I think that we can fall prey to a kind of Kuyperian secularism sometimes around here that effectively naturalizes shalom and sequesters the political from the reign of Christ and becomes very predictably allied with whatever parties of the left are concerned with. Both of these are failures to live into the realities of Christ the King and the waiting of Advent, not to mention the cross-shaped life of a people who image Christ. So the rhythms of the church's life together inscript in us now this biblical imagination in a way that I think then shaped how we are sent into our public political callings. A second example of how the congregational life together is like this imagination station that incubates our political imagination is the lectionary. So this is all Whitfleet catnip, by the way. So the lectionary, for those of you who might not be familiar with the lectionary is, think of it as a kind of curriculum for congregations around the globe to be taken through the entirety of the biblical narrative over a 3-year period so that we are all called to confront every sort of nook and cranny and corner of Scripture. And it's the Scripture we encounter is not just like what the pastor feels like preaching about this week. So it's a discipline to which congregations submit themselves to encounter the entire counsel of God, including those parts that challenge our preferences and haunt our learned political leanings. Now, how could this be a sort of disciplining of our political imagination? Well, any congregation whose worship is governed by the lectionary is going to find that they keep running into widows, orphans, and alien immigrants. And you keep bumping into this reality, and you have to grapple with it. We will regularly be reminded in that the soundtrack of the kingdom is a song sung by a choir from every tribe and tongue and nation. In a sense, I think everyone's partisan confidences will be unsettled by such an immersion in the biblical narrative. So what would such a Christ-haunted, biblically saturated politics look like? Well, I think it looks a lot like the civil rights movement. It looks a lot like the civil rights movement, which was unapologetically biblical, rooted in the practices of the church. The only way that you could produce the kind of people who could endure nonviolently is if they have been habituated by disciplines and practices. They speak to the public in the cadences of the prophets. And yet, the civil rights movement also nonetheless believed that this had something to say to a whole nation. It was not a sectarian project. It was not trying to carve out an alternative polis. There is a sense in which it shows us that the political is always more than federal electoral politics. The civil rights movement was a public witness that engaged many layers of our common life. A prophetic movement that, on the one hand, isn't it interesting how closely tied it is to cities in our imagination, right? Birmingham, Montgomery, Selma. But it's also one that spoke to state governments, Mississippi, Georgia. So that the political, even in this vision, is not reduced to the federal circus that blasts on airport televisions 24/7. I think it's really important that we break out of that narrow definition. The political here isn't even just governmental. Of course, we are hoping for justice in legislatures. But politics, in a sense, is this forged, shared life of the polis, which finds expression in a million ways beyond the Capitol, the State House, or the City Hall. So yes, absolutely, I want legislators who are occupying these spaces, who are in those spheres of influence, fueled by this biblical imagination and trying to contribute to our society. But let's also remember that politics, in the sense, is broader than that. That it's also the coalition of justice voters tackling the injustice of mass incarceration on multiple levels. It's ICCF working for housing stability as just this baseline of shalom that so many of us take for granted. It's the Believe to Become initiative that tries to help students before they ever get to school. The political, in some ways, is as intimate as our parish. The witnesses and the martyrs of the civil rights movement embody what I'm calling Christian politics. They learn to long for a better country, as the writer to the Hebrews put it, but they also imagine that this country could look more like that one. That's the posture of a Christian politics. Let me say just two more things about what I think are some of the implications of this model. And here again, I want to think especially of sort of my non-Christian fellow citizen who might be getting nervous about all this. The first is this. the sort of Christian political imagination I'm sketching here is not an enemy of liberal democracy. That is, it is not given to the demonization of liberalism that seems to characterize some reactionary, despairing stances that seem to be trending right now. To the contrary, the Christian political imagination I'm describing is actually attuned to the vagaries and contingencies of history and has an audacious claim to make that, in fact, many of the intuitions and institutions that we value in liberalism and constitutional democracy are the fruit of the gospel in particular. Not just some vaguely theistic claims, not just vaguely moral or natural law implications, but the fruit of the gospel in particular. Once again, Oliver O'Donovan puts it this way: like the surface of a planet pocked with craters by the bombardment it receives from space, the governments of the passing age show the impact of Christ's dawning glory. There is such an interesting story to be told here about the history of the values of liberal democracy as we've inherited them, which are not just natural and are also not just the fruit of Enlightenment rationality, but are the dents and craters of particularly ecclesial gospel concepts on our public life together. So Christians could not anathematize liberalism precisely because it's one of the craters of the gospel's impact on our political life. But now here's the bite on the other side is, neither then should secular progressives imagine that there's a dichotomy between Christian faith and the ideals of liberal democracy. In fact, those ideals live on the borrowed capital of the church's impact on our political lives. And I actually think one of the tasks of public theology today is almost a little bit of a public service of historical education that points out this history, the contingency of that history. This is how I see Nicholas Wolterstorff's work on rights and tracing its religious heritage. It's also the work that John Whitty is doing at Emory Law School on the ways in which the Protestant Reformation made such a significant contribution to what became the institutions of constitutional democracy. Secondly, liberalism and the sort of pluralist project that is the American experiment depends on formative communities that instill habits and dispositions in citizens that enable them to be patient, tolerant, humble, and forgiving. In other words, there's something at the very heart of this American experiment that requires citizens who have those kinds of virtues and dispositions. This is our friend John Anazu is coming to the January series in January. Please attend his talk on confident pluralism. This is where that conversation is located. But here's the thing. So if you want that vision of a sort of liberal democratic pluralism where you have tolerance and patience and forgiveness, you need people with those dispositions. But late modern liberalism has not really created the sorts of institutions that can make those kinds of people. Instead, it has lived for too long on the borrowed capital of religious communities. I think this is one of the most important arguments of Yuval Levin's book, The Fractured Republic, that in many ways, the liberal project has depended on and lived off the borrowed capital of quote-unquote illiberal communities who do this formative work. Healthy, formative, unapologetically religious communities can be some of the most important incubators for the citizens our pluralist project needs. For example, think of it this way. People who confess their sins, who forgive as they are forgiven, who trust in a grace beyond themselves, are the sorts of people who should not be surprised by difference, who have a deep patience in the face of frustration, and maybe are just humble enough to listen. That all turns out to be pretty germane to the democratic dream. So, this distinctly Christian political imagination I'm arguing for is not a threat to our public pluralistic common life. I think it would be more of a gift. Now, I can imagine this all sounds a bit quixotic. Hope always looks that way through the lens of what takes itself to be hard-nosed realism. And in a secular age, we imagine Christianity is less and less plausible. But what if there are cracks in the secular? What if its strain is showing? What if there's more openness than we might expect? In this respect, I've always been drawn to an observation in one of John Updike's earliest short stories. At one point, he says this: "The churches of Greenwich Village had this second-century quality. In Manhattan, Christianity is so feeble, its future seems before it." Who knows? Why not? Our political witness, friends, is not pegged to what's expedient or winnable. And political prudence shouldn't be reduced to calculating pragmatism. The past is no predictor of the future when you believe that Jesus rose from the dead. It's also why our concerns shouldn't devolve into despair. I love the line from Marilyn Robinson in a recent piece where she says, "Fear is not a Christian habit of mind." Fear is not a Christian habit of mind. The politics of fear, on either right or left, is alien to the city of God. To the contrary, a people who praise an ascended king will be characterized by a kind of impatient hope which is not pegged to the cultural winds. So why not imagine the possibility that a Christian political imagination could be an alluring wake-up call for a society that has tried everything else? It was once. The flourishing of our neighbors and the vulnerable among us might depend on it. And people might be more open than ever to hearing about a kingdom animated by love. Thanks very much.
Well, I don't know why you said that I would turn my nose up at this, the audacity of it, because these, of course, I'm a political scientist, and
I'm just waiting for the reality check to kick in now.
I mean, you can actually measure doctrines. I mean, these are testable hypotheses, right?
Sure.
And so, well, I guess the first question I wanted to ask has to do with what would happen if the way you've described the church worked too well. So, you know, there's been a lot of public discussion about that thinks about the church as a kind of bulwark, as a kind of hived-off refuge, and some suggestions along those lines that we ought to move in those kinds of directions. You're suggesting the church is somewhat more like a seedbed, or it's this place in which which we develop these, which is formative, not protective. But well, you called me out as a political scientist. It started to get me thinking about how for some political scientists there's been this distinction between different types of trust and other kinds of dispositions. One type of trust is bonding trust. So you develop within a community like a church high levels of trust with other members and high boundaries around the church itself. But as you say, part of the liturgy is to be sent.
Yes.
So my first question is, you know, how do you think about a different type of trust, a bridging trust? How do these formative practices of the church bridge outside of it? And
say a little bit more about bridging trust. What characterizes bridging trust?
Yeah, so bridging trust, this is all part, you know, if you read Robert Putnam and others who think and write about social capital, these norms and networks that enable collective decision-making. One of the ways that they'll talk is that, you know, we develop different types of trust. One is bonding trust, these high boundaries, but bridging trust pushes our experience outside of the communities that form us. So it's as if trust travels outside of where we learn it. And so, you know, when you talk about liturgies, I wonder where in our liturgies within the church do we find ways that we bridge?
It's a great question. I mean, my initial thought is, ideally, this is totally ideal. Ideally, in fact, our congregations would already, internal to themselves, be spaces where you would have to learn bridging trust, because there would be real difference in our congregations. I fear that, Bill Bishop's book, The Big Sort, I fear that that's less and less true, that we have much more monolithic, sequestered social realities in our congregation. But ideally, there's something about all of us sitting around the table learning to love across the kinds of divides that divide us elsewhere would be the beginning of learning how to build trust across that. That might be part of it. The other thought, and this is all inadequate to a very good question. The other piece that makes me think is, in some ways, I wonder if having a kind of center of gravity and confidence and identity makes you less anxious about encountering difference when you are sent. So that in a way, because everything is not volatile and up in the air for you, and you have some kind of sense of who you are and whose you are and who you're part of, that gives you this kind of baseline confidence almost, that's not quite the right word, so that now you could encounter difference in ways that you're not like fearful. And in that sense, I wonder if folks who don't have that kind of centering experience, and I think it's becoming increasingly difficult to find where you would find that outside of something like religious communities, would that explain why people are so frantic about difference, and therefore why we create all of our own echo chambers? I mean, do political scientists say the diminishment of bridging trust is just a sort of across-the-board problem?
Yeah, in some ways, all of the ways that we, say, consume media, sort of mating, housing choices that we make, and of course choices that we make about church, and all these other areas in public and social life where we meet each other have these markers of division and high-bounded bonding trust. And so it's not just within the church, but you're calling out the church as
totally. In other words, I'm arguing for this. Here's the picture of how it could go and should go and what the possibilities are. But now the on-the-ground ethnography of where our congregations are, I worry, is also a sort of mating, in a sort of sense. And so that there's no magic bullet here that as long as you're going to church, you're learning to cross difference, because in fact we all have boutique congregations where everybody goes and looks like everybody else in the congregation, which is why, at least I'm arguing for, this is why the reform and renewal of our congregations is important, not that they already are that.
It's interesting, a second ago you said that perhaps churches provide a place where there's a certain kind of confidence that's built that provides a kind of stance, let's say, in which you can then engage the world. And that does bring to mind John Anazu's work on confident pluralism. That book, Confident Pluralism, suggests that, among other things, we need to develop a set of dispositions. In some ways, I read what you're doing as saying that in our own traditions, or in these parts, Kuyperian traditions, where we put a lot of emphasis on structural pluralism and these directional pluralism, confessional pluralism, and so forth, that in some ways you are suggesting we also need to attend to a kind of dispositional, maybe a dispositional pluralism, or at least we lose dispositions. We lose these virtues in the mix.
Yes, I think part of the diagnosis would be this, is I get why in our Reformed and particularly Kuyperian conversations, we are so trying to break out of the apolitical individualism that characterizes a lot of other North American Protestantism. So we emphasize the systemic, the structural, and I'm all for that. What's interesting, though, is you can almost migrate to a merely systemic and structural analysis and miss the fact that you still need to be attuned to the kinds of agents who inhabit and populate those systems and structures. So for me, it's both structure and virtue. That is, what are the dispositions that characterize good citizens? And I think you've said before, citizenship language has been even in political theory discussions, has reflected both sides of that, right? That there's a sense of this is the sorts of systems we need in place for good citizenship, but then this is what civic formation looks like, so that people can really pull that off. What I worry about right now is we find ourselves in a way. I'm a Canadian who's immigrating to the United States. Our citizenship is in process, but. I do think the American system is this kind of like really, really fascinating experiment. So the system is in place, but now it's becoming clear that you need agents pulling the levers, and you need citizens inhabiting those. And I'm not sure that we've been doing the civic formational work to meet that. And all I'm saying, by the way, I'm not saying everybody has to be a Christian to be a good liberal democratic citizen. I'm just saying Christian communities should be forming people who make contributions in that respect.
I would say political theory has moved from a posture in the 1970s really focusing on sort of political liberalism and emphasis on what's the relationship of the individual with the state. Then it moved through a mode, sometimes we talked about as a kind of communitarianism. You know, what's the role of the community in its various forms through the 80s. But by the time we get to the 90s, there's this emphasis on citizenship. What does it mean to have the virtues, dispositions, skills, civic skills and so forth of the good citizen? And so there was a lot of talk about, sometimes it goes by, in the language of social capital, sometimes in the language of civic virtues, and a lot of contestation about what the good virtues are. So actually, maybe that's another question. Nazu identifies virtues. You mentioned them here: tolerance, patience, a kind of humility. When I look at those virtues, I can get my brain, from a Christian perspective, I can get my brain around patience and humility. One of the virtues, though, that I've often thought is somewhat more problematic, something that we have to argue to, is tolerance. Because tolerance generally is just putting up with things that you find objectionable. And if I thought about the church as forming us as good citizens who can put up with what we find objectionable, it's pretty thin, right? How would you think about that?
It's funny, I remember when I was in grad school in the 90s, we were like post-tolerance. We were like, tolerance already is so judgmental, we should be like celebrating diversity and stuff. But these days, wouldn't you just take tolerance? Maybe tolerance would be an improvement over our current situation. I'm less allergic. Tolerance is not all, and it's not substantive enough. But I think, for me, that is almost a key feature of what eschatological waiting looks like, right? So it would be realizing, for example, in Augustine, what's interesting, there is that regrettable Donatist episode about the kind of imposition. But what was interesting is he never, ever thought that they should compel Jews or pagans to become Christians. Because there is this sense in which we're waiting, you expect difference, and what you want are systems of peaceableness in which you can tolerate, so that ultimately I disagree, but tolerance at this point is making room for disagreements about the ultimate so that we can collaborate on the proximate. And in that sense, I think the fallout of tolerance would come from the church realizing we're still waiting and having a little bit of that eschatological remainder so that we don't think it's up to us to sort of impose kingdom come. What's interesting to me on those virtues, I push back on Nazu a little bit because John talks about them as dispositions. But he doesn't quite name them as virtues. And I think the reason he does, and I think he concedes the point, but the reason he doesn't is because if you talk about things as virtues, you actually have to embed them in a particular tradition, a particular narrative with a substantive vision of the good. And there's not going to be just one of those. And there are other ways in which late modern liberal democracy is kind of allergic to stipulating that. I would rather foster multiple communities who might even have different ultimate stories about the good, but within them they are actually creating, this is where I think Christians and Muslims and Jews have so much room to collaborate on what it looks like to contribute to a pluralistic society.
I think it also has something to do, the language of dispositions or of norms has something to do with a kind of allergy to the normative nature of it. So Robert Putnam talks about it as a set of norms, or social capital. But he explicitly says, I don't want to call it virtue, even though it looks a lot like
Interesting.
virtue.
Interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
And it just doesn't feel quite social scientific enough.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Maybe
Gotcha.
that's
Yeah,
part
that could
of
be.
it.
Could
I don't
well
think
be. Could
John's
well be.
necessarily
No, that's
doing
right.
that,
Yeah.
So another question then. In your book, you mention, I would say in passing, well, no, actually you talk about pedagogy and a kind of catechesis.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could just talk about that. How would you describe a kind of civic catechesis within the church? What is that? What would that look like? This kind of almost education about the liturgy.
Well, in some ways, so I don't want to turn the church into a chaplain of the state, but so I think the way, you tell me if this is what you're thinking, or you answer the question. I think part of what I imagine is it's almost like an unintended byproduct. It's almost like a spillover effect that it turns out that learning how to inhabit the messiness of congregational life, which is like a little outpost of the city of God, which is, serving on council, and we're Reformed, so there's always a committee to be part of, and there's something about the kinds of almost micro realities of learning to live into congregational life that now is forging in you certain kinds of dispositions and habits of knowing how to compromise, how to discern, how to identify and plan, and in a way that kind of contributes to. Is that sort of what you had in mind?
It is.
I know you've thought about this more than I
wanted
have.
to get you to say that.
Yes.
No, I mean, essentially, when I look at the kind of political structures within the church, the bureaucratic structures within the church, the way we engage in committee work and so forth, and I've done a lot of it. And I often wonder, to what extent are we taking a step back and reflecting on whether we are reproducing ways that you do this kind of bureaucratic work outside the church? Or are we in fact engaging in a set of practices that we could say are distinctively honoring of Jesus Christ, or of our faith commitments?
Well, and it's interesting. So Whitty in the Reformation of Rites says this is why there's something uniquely going on in the Protestant Reformation churches, he says, because that for example, that commitment to plurality of leadership creates a kind of diffusion of responsibility for governing ourselves that then spills over and translates into representative democracy. And it's a much longer story than that. But I find that a very suggestive, and I think it's a really important story to tell, because there's a kind of a sector of Christian public intellectuals right now who just want to sort of anathematize liberal democracy, as if that was it's a little bit of a kind of Brad Gregory argument. Oh, that's the fruit of modernity. Modernity is disordering, gets you autonomy. And I'm saying, no, it's way more complicated than that. And it turns out Protestantism has something to say about that.
Yeah. I want to open it up.
Great.
Because I know there's going to be a lot of
Yes.
questions. So there is a mic here. So please step up to the mic if you have questions.
Hello.
That mic apparently is at a height for me rather than you.
That's much better. Okay. So thank you for your lecture. I very much enjoyed it, by the way. You've spoken extensively about how a more doctrinally sound liturgy in the church would lead to a better Christian politics. How can a doctrinally sound liturgy shaped by and practiced in our private lives contribute to a better Christian politics?
In our private lives?
Yes.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it would be, imagine, let's think of it this way. And this is the picture more in volume 1 of the trilogy, right? That in a sense, I'm arguing that our communal congregational life, gathering around word and table, is this kind of centering hub for forming our affections and our imagination. But the trajectory of that worship is to be sent. So we gather to scatter, right? But that means that even in our Monday to Saturday scatteredness, we still have to keep finding disciplines to sort of keep rehearsing that scriptural narrative as our sort of centering story. So this is where, in a way, it's almost like you take this kind of picture of liturgical formation and then you hook it to a Dallas Willard train. And Dallas Willard, or Richard Foster in A Celebration of Discipline, the spiritual disciplines, although also maybe something like Shane Claiborne's Book of Common Prayer, which is meant to be also kind of communal, where people are living in proximity and can observe these things together, that then keeps forming us throughout the week. It's interesting. John Calvin had this vision where he wanted all of Geneva to be a magnum monasterium. He wanted the thing to be, not because everybody would be celibate, but who would move to Geneva, but because it would be this city that was framed by the disciplines and practices of prayer. So that morning psalms and evening psalms are what would bookend the life of butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers in their work. And I think looking for those kinds of rhythms reinforces that imagination. But sorry, I can run with this. I also think it's really important, right, that we are sent to be scattered and to live amongst those that disagree with us. Do you know what I mean? It's interesting. Our sending is to live amidst citizens of the earthly city, not to sequester ourselves and try to protect ourselves. Because if we did that, we would actually be forsaking our call to serve them and to love them and to build institutions that would nourish them. So that might be a bit still generic, but that's what yeah.
Thank you, sir.
You bet.
Hi, Jamie.
Hi, Dan.
I want to go in the other direction from private to the congregation. I liked what you said about the lectionary compelling congregants to reflect on the whole counsel of God.
Yeah.
But I wonder if you see the very structure of the evangelical church in America as being something of an obstacle to that, because since the 18th century, it's actually had a kind of a market model.
Yes.
Rather than preachers preaching to congregations and instructing them in the word, there has been a tendency for congregations to pick preachers that reinforce their prior understanding of what the word teaches. And if you don't like what the preacher says, you go to a different church.
Yes.
And preachers all know that,
Yeah.
which is, I think, a source of a great deal of cowardice coming from the pulpit. There's just a real reluctance to say things that are going to tick off either a rich donor or just a lot of the members of your congregation, because if they leave, you're out of a job.
Yeah.
So tell us about the structure of the evangelical church in America and to the extent to which maybe there's a hidden advantage to our non-statist, private sector model of the church, or whether in fact it's an obstacle that we're going to have to figure out how to get around.
Yeah, it's a really $64 million question. So and unfortunately, I'm not going to trot out an answer that says, actually, here's the secret genius of evangelical non-denominationalism. That's actually, because I do, sorry, some of my best friends are evangelical, but I do think that this is a structural problem, right? And so some of it reflects a kind of revivalist mode, some of it reflects just kind of American valuing of autonomy and independence, so that the priority there on choice and preference and has only skyrocketed in the age of the boutique church kind of thing. That said, I will say, here's the one little bit of encouragement. I'm out and about enough to see this really interesting phenomenon of congregations and pastors who are realizing that they are working without a net and that they need help, partly because it's almost like it's sort of a backdoor strategy, because what is happening is, I would say that they are coming to see the deformative power of cultural liturgies. It's almost like what they wake up to first is the formative power of these cultural liturgies and rituals and practices, and then they're looking at their congregational life and practices and realizing we don't have fire to fight that fire. And so it has created an interesting sort of minority report, to be sure, of even evangelicals in sort of typical non-denominational spaces who are looking back to, I think, pre-modern wisdom about what formative disciplines, practices look like, sort of decentralizing the sermon, re-emphasizing the sacraments, recovering some of these practices. I know Nazarene churches that are actually Book of Common Prayer services. So again, I don't want to treat that as a magic a silver bullet, but I think there's interesting reports. I think what you've diagnosed is part of the problem, though. It is part of the challenge. Yeah. That said, by the way, CRC polity is not allergic to such congregationalism either. Yeah.
You know, while you're coming up, I just mentioned that there is this evidence, empirical evidence of what you were describing of churches as, in some ways, not political enough. So, you know, all the survey, Corwin Smith's done work on pastors, for example, and when you look at just survey data on what pastors say about what they do in the church, it comes out, for all the talk that we hear about pastors speaking very directly on partisan issues, vast majority, of course, aren't speaking to those matters at all, precisely for reasons that you described.
Yeah, interesting.
And so, in some ways, that's an invitation to say, can churches have a different type of politics, reinvigorate politics, but in a different way? Please.
I'm very interested in what you've talked about with secular liturgies, and particularly that that we underestimate the effect that it has on us. And in your Desiring the Kingdom book, you had several examples of secular liturgies, and I distinctly remember the one about if you don't think that these are powerful, try sitting down for the national anthem sometime.
Yeah.
And I thought at the time, no, I'm not going to try that. And now people have, and clearly we've seen what reactions you get.
Yes.
I just wonder if you could speak more to how can we recognize secular liturgies, or how can we more clearly see what they're doing so that we don't underestimate their power?
Right. So I had a Washington Post op-ed about exactly this on Thanksgiving Day, because to me, Thanksgiving Day is one of the sort of high holy days of the NFL liturgical calendar. And to recognize, maybe one criterion for recognizing secular liturgies is if people resist and are treated as infidels, you know that you are on the terrain of the religious. So that even though it's not claiming to be institutional, it doesn't have anything to do with God, if we treat resistance as heresy, then clearly we are on the terrain of a kind of secular liturgical environment. By the way, you could also say there are many ways in which universities can also be this kind of space, right? In other words, where unwritten orthodoxies are used to discipline and sort of marginalize anybody who won't play by that rule. It's another sign that what an institution that takes itself to be secular is nonetheless a kind of novitiate that's forming you into a particular narrative in a covert way. So maybe that's one of the criteria for looking at it. The secular liturgy analysis is always going to be very contextual, cultural. In many ways, it's relative to class, I think, and national boundaries make a difference. You know what I mean? Like, nationalism is not a super live temptation in Canada. But that doesn't mean there are no political idolatries. It's just a different kind of context, yeah. I mean, we all know Canada is slightly closer to shalom than anywhere else, but yeah. Jonas.
So I am intrigued by the emphasis on a Christian hope that also simultaneously went hand in hand with your reference to folks like William Jennings and J. Cameron Carter, and the idea that I'm curious about two parts to the question, I guess. What is kind of the ethical demand for a church that's been complicit in white supremacy and avoiding an actual confrontation of antagonism? Like, what's the ethical demand of sitting with, I guess, the negative with this complicity? And how does, because it seems like there's the risk of rushing too quickly to the hope in a way that converts or absolves the church of its own complicity in a really harmful way, because I think Carter would suggest that you act like the church needs to spend a really long time carefully sitting with this. So I'm just curious what you think about kind of that ethical element to sitting with, or to steal Zizek's term, tarry with the negative, if you will.
Yeah, it's interesting you ask, because so there's a section in that chapter that's just called "Stand There and Take It," which is, don't try to explain it, don't try to justify it, don't try to rush to resolving it or forgive it. There's a certain sense, and it will be especially people like me who just need to sit and listen and absorb and not rush to reconciliation or something like that, right? What's interesting is, it's funny, I'm reading a book right now called Anti-Blackness and Christian Ethics. And I would say this question of hope is the pinch point between something you've taught me about, the Afro-pessimism conversation, and I've been reading a lot of Ta-Nehisi Coates. I think it's really, really important that the church sort of enter into that space, as you put, tarry with the negative. It is interesting that the African-American theologians in this other collection also do note that Christian eschatology is just going to be this point of divergence, but let's not rush to emphasize the divergence, right? It's to sort of name that. Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. The philosophers are out in force.
Can I call you Jamie now?
No, absolutely not. I'm just kidding.
To sort of narrow the scope of inquiry just a little bit, to maybe see if the theoretical apparatus has some, real cutting, practical consequences. I'm wondering if you have any particular ideas about how this general picture applies to sort of redeeming public discourse as a sort of local case of what it means to live in the polis.
Can you say a little bit more? Like, do you have an example in mind, or?
Well, so the provocation for this question was actually a conversation I had over lunch with somebody about types of conversations that prompt a lot of pessimism about, the public discourse surrounding certain issues is just so toxic, but not only is it toxic, but it's the sort of thing where, two persons that disagree can't help but disagree in very uncharitable terms,
Yes. Yes.
So that's more what I had in mind.
Yeah. So it's a good question. Just thinking on my feet, a couple things come to mind. One is the fact that we are a people who regularly practice confession should mean something about how quick we are habituated to say sorry. That might be part of it. I think I guess what I would hope for in terms of this, like just the toxic nature of public discourse, is that we would also learn how to be a people who are quiet and silent. By the way, I think we could use a lot more silence in our worship, just to practice not playing along with incessant chatter. And at the very least, I guess what I hope is we would be practicing a way of life in which we are always learning to listen for the image of God in the other person. And so there's a kind of charity that should characterize me. And maybe I'm slow to speak and quick to listen. That all sounds platitudinous at this point. And yet, if you actually did it if you actually tried to do that on Facebook, I wonder, first of all, it would be a lot less activity, which is probably good. But maybe there's something about also proximate life together rather than abstract, digitized lives apart, something like that. It's a good question. I need to think about it more.
We've got another. Okay, 4.
John Whitbleet, Worship Institute. Jamie, thank you. Wonderful. So grateful for your work over these 10 years. And it's wonderful to see how many people really all over the world have been shaped by it. So on behalf of all of us, tremendous thanks. And Kevin, thanks not only for tonight, but for the way your shop makes this message resonate in so many places. If all of our political engagement is liturgically shaped, we need to do a lot more to realize how political every worship service is. Tomorrow in a class at Calvin Seminary, certain students here will be in it. We're going to be discussing public prayer, public intercessory prayer. how in Grand Rapids on January 14 of this year, half the congregations will be praying passionately about racial reconciliation in light of MLK Day, and half the congregations will be praying about pro-life issues, and very few congregations will pray about both. And how many people tonight are preparing for worship on Sunday thinking about how to pray not just for peace in the Middle East, but for peace and justice in the Middle East? And how much there has been an avoidance of engagement around issues of sexual harassment in public worship. How few congregations ever heard the word Charlottesville after Charlottesville. So, Jamie, if you were writing a letter to a young Reformed prayer leader about the prayer of the people on Sunday.
Contact John Whitfleet, but go on.
And I'd actually think that this ought to be a Kevin Jamie letter together, a political scientist and a philosopher that give advice not only on what is said, but the process by which that 5-minute period is shaped. So that what we don't end up practicing is, it seems to me, in so many places, we practice conflict avoidance.
Yeah.
And then actually aren't we creating just the seedbed of the disaster we've seen over the last 2 years?
Yes.
So
No, it's a great question, and I know you already have the answer to your question. It strikes me that part of it is also, so the prayer of God's people, I do think, is just such a significant formative space for our congregations. And I wonder if part of it is probably the practices of the prayers of God's people, the pastoral prayer, already reflect kind of baseline practices within communities and congregations, right? So they either reflect the disorder or dysfunction of those congregations, or they reflect a kind of collective discernment. It just strikes me that when you put it that way, what would it be like for anyone who's offering the prayer of God's people week by week to do so also not just individually, but has a sort of a micro community within a congregation and the neighborhood that they are listening to, right? That in a sense, we are in a priestly function there. We're trying to channel these realities. It also seems important to me that every week, it's never a snapshot of a week. It's the ongoing video of a congregation's life together, right? And how to live into that. In D.C. this week, we were talking, on the one hand, I think it's so crucial for American congregations to have some way of hearing voices interjected into their lives from outside the United States, just because I am the last person who's going to recognize the cultural liturgies that have really captivated me. Do you know? That's why Deanna is here. She points out she's the Holy Spirit's kind of favorite. And in a similar way, I think our habits of disposition in this respect are going to be so close to us that we need people outside of our context to do that. Now, that could also actually be internal, so that if congregations had sister congregations that are outside of their socioeconomic sort of niche or comfort zone or something, it seems like listening is such a huge discipline to then know how to pray priestly for neighborhoods, parishes, cities, congregations. I'm so good, or so appreciative of that question, even though it's not a good answer. I would also point them to the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship website.
Well, first of all, thank you again, and both your response and Dr. Woodfleet's previous question served as a nice segue to what I had in mind.
Great.
So 2 concepts of some of your previous books came to mind. The performative function of language, very recurring theme in continental philosophy, which you spoke about in Thinking in Tongues, very much immersed around the life of local churches that express gifts of praise and gifts of diversity, not only within the Pentecostal charismatic spectrum, but throughout the whole kingdom of God that, in the church that started on Pentecost. And the second concept from You Are What You Love that struck me was the mall as space of as an altar, as an altar, or as a sacred space, and that is consumerism in this case. So much of the culture that the church and that evangelicalism in the U.S. is wrapped around is tied into what David Platt called a confusion in his book Radical, a confusion between the kingdom of God, or the citizenship of God's people as the church, and the American dream. And so much of that is tied into the ideology of consumerism, and like one of the gentlemen here said, seeing the church as a product, or something that you like, and if you don't like it anymore, you can just get another one. And we're in a I'm wondering, in a world, in a milieu where everything is so wrapped around ideology, to even bring up ideas of privilege or powerlessness or disenfranchisement, to bring these ideas up and read biblical texts or study the Word of God in these keys, these hermeneutical keys, would seem to churches that, to many places, as too political or too radical, or they would immediately be pointed to the left as, well, we don't want this vision, this political view tied to a party. So keeping all of these ideological suspicions that people are so wrapped around in our polarized context today, how do we allow for God's flow in liturgy as a formative component of our church's lives, to overcome bipartisanism, to overcome polarization? Because we do need civil society participation. And we do need to transform realities, but we also need to go beyond a bipartisan binary thinking all the time.
It's interesting. I appreciate that. It's funny, I was thinking today, on the one hand, if any party just reliably has you in their pocket, it probably means that you are not finding your center in the city of God. That said, I also don't think that it's prudent to look for some sort of non-partisan, pure space from which I can operate. In other words, I think prudence in my sending probably looks like getting invested in the messiness of party politics, as long as they can't count on me as just this sort of good soldier. Does that sound fair? So one of the things I don't think I ever talk about in the book is a third way. So, because that's just almost so cliche. It's like, oh, well, we're going to do this third way. Well, yeah, you know where third ways end up? Making no difference whatsoever. It's more like, instead of forging this space between, what I'm saying is, what does it look like to be a people whose loves and longings and affections and imagination that forms our prudence is centered in the city of God and the hope of a coming king. And then from that, we lean out into the messiness, prudential judgments, discernment that looks like building institutions, forging a common life, and doing so in a way that, it recognizes that sometimes faithful compromise is part of that waiting as well. I'm not sure. And it's why Christians will have prudential disagreements about strategies of these kind of things. One of the things that struck me when we were in D.C. this week is D.C. churches are also not talking about this. Mm-hmm. So an Episcopal priest that we were with on Sunday said, oh, no, we've reached a consensus in Washington, actually. The consensus is in all of our congregations, we're not talking about it. That's right. Really unsettling and worrisome.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think we have 3 questions here, so we're going to limit ourselves to that.
My colleague Trevor Cooling published a book last year studying teachers in English church schools.
Yes, I know it, yes.
And one of the intriguing little pieces of data he has is he found teachers whose way of teaching normally in the classroom was very interactive. There was space for student voices, there was discussion, there was inquiry. That in the moment when they were asked to do something Christian, they would then call a plenary and give a mini lecture and give the correct answer to something, and that they somehow had this instinctive sense that was what being Christian meant, was to give the right answer from the front with nobody else speaking. Now he ascribed that to their epistemology, but it's not hard to imagine a liturgical influence. A number of your examples tonight have been from the content of the liturgy, Christ the King and the widow and the orphan and so on. When you started talking about silence, that started edging more towards the pedagogy of the liturgy. I'm curious what other thoughts you have about how the pedagogy of the liturgy might need to be focused on if it's to have the kind of effects you're hoping for in terms of engagement other than proclamation.
Yes. So that was volume 2. There's a sense in which volume 3, awaiting this public theology, is presuming the first 2. And in volume 2, imagining the kingdom, what I argue is that, in fact, if you think of Christian worship as a pedagogy of the Spirit that is training our loves and affections and imaginations, you have to realize that the way to the heart is through the body. So that there are rhythms and routines, and it's why Christians have always sung, right? It's an embodied mode, but it's also the fact that we confess on our knees. It means I understand something about humility and confession here that I can't understand by just saying the words. So that kind of I'm with you on the embodiment, and unfortunately, I have not written about silence, but it's been in spending time in congregations over the past year that I've realized that actually silence is a very embodied reality. Do you know what I mean? Like to create silence within a congregation, people freak out. They can't handle it. And it's because there is this sort of like almost existential weight that starts pressing on you. And I would love for us to think more intentionally about that kind of stuff. Yeah.
So I'm curious, as we approach in our church life, moving more towards traditional liturgies, how do we approach some of the problematic parts of a lot of traditional catechisms or liturgies? Because obviously they have a lot of weight. They're written by amazing people of God, but there are, when they were written, they were also brought in with their cultural baggage, just like if we tried to reform some practices or liturgies of the church, we would also bring in our cultural baggage. How do we seek reform while also tempering where we come from as well? Yeah, so one of the things I always sort of try to bend over backwards to not say is that I'm advocating for traditional, because I don't care that it's traditional. What I care about is that it's intentional and that it reflects that what I'm talking about is a narrative arc of Christian worship that reflects the story of God in Christ reconciling the world to himself. Now that the church's collective discerned wisdom about that sort of narrative arc, I think is sort of grows over time and is contributed to by Christians from all around the world across time, so that and by the way, it grows out of Israel. Right, so it does have it has a cultural history. It doesn't fall from heaven, but it's also not like some people like to suggest that liturgy is Anglo, which is that's just not true. It's just not historically true. That said, the ways they get contextualized and embedded can then sometimes become so reified that you almost can't imagine this liturgy except the way your grandma experienced it in 1950, which is we do need to sort of learn how to break out of that reification a little bit. But what's interesting, I think, Catherine Pickstock has made this argument, that the more you have this kind of Catholic, small c, Catholic spine of what you think formative Christian worship looks like, actually the more free you are to embed it contextually and let it reflect the cultures of which it is ministering and to which it is ministering. And I think that's really, really crucial. I think it's probably especially important for those of us in the Reformed tradition who already when we imagine quote unquote liturgy, we think 1950 was a long time ago, and that's ancient. But what we're actually trying to do is push much deeper than that, and then it actually becomes more flexible. And none of this is about style in that sense. So, and finally, our liturgical rehearsal, so to speak, is always subject to reform and renewal as well, right? We're never just pristinating some embodiment of it. It's always about discernment. It's one of the reasons, why I think silence is so crucial in this cultural moment, maybe in ways that it wasn't in 1600, because of the constant chatter. That's cicw.org. Is that the website? No, I'm just kidding. Yeah. So it's a very, very important question. It's such a long, and I think it's really important that we sit there and we listen from people
listen to people from around the world who have also reflected on this, so it's not just privileging our kind of locale, so to speak. Yeah, it's very important.
All right, last question.
The privilege of last question.
Thank you, and I was glad this is open to the public. I'm from one of those traditions that practices silence.
Great.
Being among
We should
friends,
sit here and listen.
Some of the things I wanted to address is because I've read some of your books and I've really enjoyed them, and so because I haven't read all of them, there were some things I'd like to engage by further reading.
Yeah.
They tend to be, I was a little surprised to hear you speak the way you did about a third way, and one of the things that I'd like people to consider or ask you about is, while liberal democracy may be an effective way of getting citizens to participate and engage with one another to produce amazing outcomes, is that at all the call of the church? And so as we talk about a third way and participation in electoral politics, I think you've mentioned a lot the eschatological nature of the church. And I'm not hearing the apocalyptic nature of the gospel, and I do not mean end times, but I mean trust that outcomes will be the way they are supposed to, whether we realize them or not, and that indeed we may suffer for being faithful to those outcomes. I think liberal democracy gets us to not want to wait, but to coerce outcomes that we believe are favorable in terms of rights and justice-based outlooks of human relationships. I think the gospel, if we're talking about the cross, is not just sacrifice of privilege, but it's care-oriented. Mm-hmm. Rights are not God-given. Mm-hmm. They're nowhere in the text. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if if the cross and a rights and justice-based political economy, I'm not sure if the gospel transitions. So while the church may not be involved or should not be involved in liberal democratic electoral politics, that's by no means being non-political. It is being apocalyptic by reflecting the nature of the kingdom and offering that third way that is not based in coerciveness. And I'll stop after one example. You mentioned the civil rights work, and there's nothing more inspiring for many of us than the work that was accomplished by Ella Baker to Martin Luther King Jr. to Obama. But then there is Niebuhr, who calls for the federalization of state troops to protect a nonviolent march. This is not a discussion about whether that's a good thing or not. It's a discussion about why is not the white church sacrificing with marchers instead of calling for a federal government to protect at gunpoint nonviolent marchers. It's sort of like the Pilate refusing to crucify the Christ and then protecting him on his way through the crowd. Yeah. We cease to be the church because we cannot give up privilege and we cannot give up control of outcomes.
Yeah. So I hope you'll find Awaiting the King is a much longer answer to a question like that. I would say it's what's intriguing is probably when I started the project, I was much more flirting with the kind of Anabaptist model that you've just sketched. And it was reading Augustine and O'Donovan that sort of made this book take so long. Because what's really at stake, and this is going to feel too abstract, but it actually is the fundamental question, is how you conceive the relationship between redemption and creation, or how you conceive the relationship between grace and nature. And since I'm convinced that the redemption that's accomplished by the cross and resurrection is the renewal of the order of creation, not the effacing of it, then in this meantime of the seculum, I think that what happens is what were the good creaturely vocations to build institutions, to administer society, to make libraries and schools and civil society, I don't think that my identity in Christ effaces my creaturely calling to exercise those. I think it renews it and reorders it. And then for me, the eschatological, and this is, I grant, we just disagree about this. But I take it as sort of inscribed in the heart of this Augustinian Reformed tradition that the eschatological piece means both that you temper your expectations of what's accomplished in the meantime, but what I would say is I don't have the luxury of not participating in the state, and not only the state, because actually that itself would be a privilege. Part of what I think, reason why, sorry, last point. The reason why I think a lot of young evangelicals, particularly during George W. Bush's, I was going to say reign, that's not right, we're particularly fascinated by Hauerwas, for example, and I get it. I was one of them. I get it because all of a sudden they woke up and they realized, whoa, the sort of complicity and assimilation that's going on here. I think what even Stanley has realized is, in a way, to check out of liberal democracy is its own kind of privilege. And that, in a sense, I'm trying to answer a call to still be pitched into that fray. I don't think it's perfect. O'Donovan actually makes a big difference between early modern democracy and late modern liberalism, and he thinks there's differences. I hope you'll be encouraged that chapter 2 of Awaiting the King is actually a long critique of liberalism. It's just that I don't think it can be a total critique. It's an ad hoc critique. This is the conversation that I think is important for Christians to be having today. And I feel like I had to go through that sort of Hauerwasian, Yoderian conversation to get to the ecclesial centering in the city of God. It's just that then that pitches me back into the mess of trying to care for the vulnerable and the marginalized by being one who can hopefully build good and just institutions. I'll stop there.
You know, what I'm about to say is going to feel very dissident. There are books to buy in the narthex.
But they're half price. So.
And they're half price. But for now, would you join me in thanking Jamie Smith?
Thank you. Thanks.